All right, this week we are talking about managing competition and conflict. The overview of the content that we're going to discuss is a couple of different things. We're going to look at a new way of thinking about conflict and competition as two separate entities, the role of public relations in conflict, and then the life cycle and managing that life cycle of conflict. So let's talk about what the difference is between conflict and competition. Sometimes people see them as the same thing, and they're really not. Public relations in general can be, it's not always, but it can be defined as the strategic management of competition and conflict. So competition being that there are other products, services, companies, people out there that offer the same thing as you. You're not necessarily in conflict, but you are competing for scarce resources, being your public. So there is that sense of competition there. However, you can exist without there being extreme conflict or even crises. Whereas conflict is also a competition for scarce resources, again, the public, but oftentimes that requires a scrambling for the competition. So you are not only competing, but you are dealing with drama that is associated with that competition. So it's another level here. Now, strategic conflict management, when we get into the details of that, is inherent in the public relations process, which means that it is something that you're going to deal with no matter who your client is. Now, some clients tend to have a little bit more conflict than others because their career path or their product or their service tends to lean that way. But regardless, you're going to deal with conflict no matter what role of PR you are in. And public relations professionals need to develop strategies in order to manage that conflict. So not only do you need to know how to handle them when they occur, but you need to manage the conflict as it progresses and even before it starts. So if you look at this chart here, it kind of gives you a process in which the factors that affect conflict management sort of occur. So you have these external and internal variables, meaning you have things that happen on the outside and things that happen within the company or within the product that lead to a stance on a situation. So whatever the conflict might be, whatever position you hold, that's your stance. And then the stance itself feeds into the strategy on how you manage the conflict. So you have the issues that cause the stance to occur or to be developed, and then that leads to the strategy and the tools in which you use to manage the conflict. Now, one of the models or modes in which we can consider conflict management is the threat appraisal model. Now, public relations professionals in any instance are going to monitor for threats, assess those threats, and arrive at a desirable stance for their organization. And then they'll begin the communication efforts from that stance, like we talked about last week. So you're going to monitor those through research, as we talked about a few weeks ago, and then go into the organization of the information and then, therefore, the strategies and tactics that you'll use to deal with any conflict that arises. And some of those are going to be based on the resources that you have, and some are going to occur just based purely on what the situation demands. So you can appraise what potential threats occur and deal with them as it comes, or deal with them prior to them ever happening with the resources that you have. Now, the contingency theory is another approach to conflict management. And the contingency factors is basically a matrix of factors that drive how you choose to stand on a topic or what stance you take. And it is shaped somewhat like a continuum. If you look at this chart here, it's a sort of, as it's described here, a dynamic and ever-changing situation based on factors. So if you look at this, if you look over here on the left side, you see advocacy. What this means is your client, depending upon the conflict, the issue, is going to very much advocate for their own position. So let's say that you are working for a food company that is being accused of E. coli poisoning or something similar like that. Advocacy would say, this is not happening, I'm going to stand against it, I'm going to advocate for my company. Whereas all the way over here on the other side, on the accommodation side, you are doing the exact opposite. You're saying, we screwed up, let me fix it, I'm going to do whatever it takes. So it doesn't have to be one end or the other, but these are the continuum sections. And within that continuum, there are all these other different ways in which a company or a product or a person could choose to handle whatever conflict arises. So it just depends on the issue, and it depends on the culture and nature of your client in the first place. Now, when we think of conflict, there are usually a set of steps or stages or a life cycle of that conflict. Now, depending upon your company and its experiences in the past and expectations for the future, you're going to find yourself in different modes of the life cycle at different times. And then you're going to recircle right back around. So if you look over here, you're going to see the proactive section. That is prior to conflict ever happening. You do environmental scanning, issues tracking, you're going to do crisis planning, and so on. That's before you ever have an issue. Then you can move to the strategic. So now a conflict has arisen. You assess the risk communication, conflict positioning, where are you going to stand, what's the stance you're going to take, and how you're going to manage it. That is in the midst of it. Now, in reactive, that is after a conflict has occurred. So in this case, you are dealing with the conflict and you're reacting to it. And then you have your recovery. That is after the conflict has occurred and you have managed it and dealt with it and used all those strategies and tactics that we mentioned before. And now you are trying to restore your image or manage that reputation in some way. And then, unfortunately, in most cases, you're going to just circle right back around here. So that is the conflict management life cycle. And if you look at some of these steps, you can kind of see where each process would occur and in what situation you would find yourself in based on the client that you choose. So again, we have the proactive phase where you are trying to prevent a conflict from arising. And then you have the strategic phase where emerging conflict is identified as needing action. So it isn't in the full thrust. You're not reacting to it, but it looks like it could happen, so you're going to address this specific conflict. Whereas back here in the proactive phase, there isn't a specific conflict, or at least not one that has exact details yet, and you're just trying to be proactive about it. So you've gone proactive, then to strategic, and now maybe you have to get to the point where you're reactive. So you must react when a conflict reaches a critical level of impact. So things got to happen. You got to get in there and you got to deal with it. So in that case, what do you do in order to manage the conflict as it's occurring? And then finally, the recovery phase, again, strategies that you employ and the aftermath to bolster or repair whatever reputation was harmed. And it, like it says here, bolster or repair. It doesn't mean that your company or your client in some way harmed their reputation, but they may need, because it was a crisis or conflict, they may need to enhance their image even more. So that's the recovery phase. Now, when you're in this life cycle of conflict, obviously you're going to manage the life cycle to the best of your ability as a PR rep. And there's typically 4 systematic processes that allow you to manage the conflict in the best possible way. You can deal with it through issues management. You can use strategic positioning and risk communication, where you plan it out and put yourself in a specific situation. You can go through a whole program plan of crisis management, which is a huge long process, or you can focus on the reputation management, where you're looking at how you are perceived in terms of reputation and not necessarily just this one conflict. So let's look at some of these real quickly. Issues management is a proactive approach to all of these things. For example, predicting problems, anticipating those threats, which we talked about a little bit earlier, and so on. So it is a proactive method of dealing with crises and conflicts. Now, you may still find yourself in a situation where you are having to react to a conflict or a crisis, but issues management approach typically tries to head them off. The strategic positioning and risk communication is a little different. So these are 2 factors. Strategic positioning is where communication efforts to position the organization favorably regarding competition and conflict. So you see an issue that is not necessarily directly related to your client, but could be applied to your client. So maybe there is an issue with environmental stuff. Dawn is a big example of this. There are all these oil spills that were happening 10, 12, 15 years ago, and Dawn positioned themselves in a strategic way in order to see themselves as an advocate, and that helps with their reputation, as opposed to a contributor. So they strategically position themselves. Now, risk communication differs in that it is an attempt to communicate risks to the public that impact health, safety, and the environment. So where you're not necessarily buddy-buddy with the issue like you are here with strategic positioning, you're almost like an advocate with risk communication. So you're putting out all those issues in advance. Now, crisis management is a little bit more engaged, and it is that issue that occurs right away. So a study by the Institute for Crisis Management found that honestly 86% of business crises were smoldering crises. What that means is they were already building for a long time before they happened, and probably could have been addressed prior to this issue exploding like it did. And that's pretty significant. Now, various organizations respond to crises in different ways. I'm sure you've seen examples of this. Coombs' crisis communication strategies are laid out here, and if you look at them in detail in your reading, you'll see what I'm talking about. Maybe some examples will pop into your mind. If you've ever seen Attack the Accuser, which happens a lot in politics, when somebody says something negative about an opponent, they will come back and attack that accuser. Depending upon your company and how they typically manage conflict or what the conflict is, it's going to possibly vary. Or maybe you have a company that just tends to lean one direction or another. It does matter what the conflict is. Looking at whether you want to do a denial, an excuse, or maybe a full apology will really determine how the conflict presents itself. So in some cases, although it sounds fantastic that full apology should be the way to go, in some cases it's not. And you could end up hurting your client even more. And it's not even the ethical way to go, depending upon the situation. So it really does matter where your client finds him or herself in order to determine what the conflict management strategy or the communication strategy would be. Now, reputation management, that's the last one of these, is a little different. There are three foundations to it. Economic performance, so how does your company do financially? Social responsiveness, so how do they react socially to conflict? How do they communicate socially? And the ability to deliver valuable outcomes to the stakeholders. So that's your reputation. It's threefold. It has all of these three aspects. And the PR rep is typically going to look at these last two. They're going to look at how you communicate socially and their ability to deliver those valuable outcomes to your stakeholder. And sometimes the image restoration is the focus. So you are looking at, say, social responsiveness. That's the component that your PR group is focused on for the moment. Let's just say that's our example. What are you going to do in order to restore an image that may not have been presented very well? So let's say your company is either completely not present on social media, or they are communicating inappropriately on social media, or one person from the company is communicating inappropriately on social media. Then you have to decide, of those reactions, denial, evading responsibility, it wasn't my job to keep this person intact, reduce offensiveness, so kind of put a band-aid over it, help to ease the pain a little bit, corrective action, you fire the person that made the inappropriate comment, or a full-blown apology, which could incorporate some of these other pieces here. You know, oftentimes includes a monetary compensation or a corrective action in terms of firing somebody or reorganizing. So these are some of the ways in which reputation management occurs. Now, honestly, if you're looking at all the stuff that we talked about, it sounds like this process, and once you get through it, you can breathe, you can move on, but it's a deja vu, to be perfectly honest. Conflict management happens over and over and over again, and you end with one and then you got to start tackling another, and or being proactive about conflict in general with your client. So this is a very big part of a public relations practitioner's job. And it could be divided, depends on how you work. If you are a one-man show or one-woman show, you are going to likely have to be the one addressing these. But if you work for, say, a big PR firm, you may not be the one that addresses the conflict, although you might get pulled in at some point. That may not be your job. It just depends on the situation. So hopefully that gives you a good general overview of conflict management, and will keep you on the right track in terms of discussions and all the other material that we're looking at this week. Have a great week, guys.